Howard spoke to us last meeting about his time in the Royal Australian Air Force. It caused me to hit the internet and find out a little bit more about Rabaul. I searched Rabaul 1942 and I was amazed at what I came up with. So I'd like to think that some of you might be keen enough to just Google Rabaul 1942 and have a read and learn a bit more about what Howard went through at that time. Howard came back to Western Australia, flew with Airlines WA, started his business as a chartered accountant, kept on flying, owned a multitude of aircraft and set a number of records, record flights throughout Australia and Western Australia. So he's going to tell you all about that.
As my 9 months on ops was up, I was sent a telegram from Wing Commander Snook, who was Managing Director of Airlines WA Limited, a company involved in intra-state routes, inviting me to join his staff of pilots. I immediately accepted and was flying for the company within weeks. I flew full-time for the next 15 months, except when my employer called me in on my days off, realising I was an accountant, to help bring Airlines WA Limited accounts up to date. My wife wasn't impressed with this duality, and she was very pleased when I stopped the full-time relationship at the end of 1945. The only aircraft that the Air Minister Fairbairn allowed us to retain at this stage were de Havilland aircraft, Rapides, a Dragonfly, and we had a twin-engine monospar with radial engines, pop-jaw engines, and they used to cruise with revs just under 3,000 RPM and a bad habit of chewing up magnetos. We pilots became quite adept at fitting a spare en route. The scheduled routes were Port Hedland Circuit, Wiluna Circuit, Esperance Circuit, Albany, Rottnest Island, and of course charters to any place in WA. At this stage we had no radio, no air hostess, and the facilities at country airports left much to be desired. Now that's a shot at Megathera, but it's not of the bow shed. We only had a bow shed, so the drill was you sent the females in one direction out into the spinifex, and the male passengers in the opposite direction, making sure that you had them all back to the bow shed before you departed. That was the arrangement at Megathera. I never had the pleasure of utilising those up-to-date facilities at Megathera. Before joining the RAAF, I'd finished my exams with the Institute of Chartered Accountants and admitted to membership in October 41. And we now had to decide whether to pursue a flying career or go into practice as an accountant. My wife Sylvia was very much in favour of the latter, of course, and one friend, Evan Saw, helped me to make up my mind by inviting me to join him in partnership in his firm at 55 St George's Terrace, Perth, under the new firm name of Saw-Wheatley and Co. It was previously Saw Newbury and Co, but Colin Newbury wanted to join another employer at that point. I had worked on Evan's staff for about 6 months before being called up, so we knew each other quite well. I continued to fill in as a spare pilot every time the others ran out of hours. I did the Saturday morning Rottnest run for quite some time, as well as alternating with a newspaper dropping run around the southwest, also on a Saturday morning, dropping the West Australian through a hole carved in the bottom of the Anson, or out of the open door of the Rapide, and we used young lads to eject the tightly bundled papers through the hatch. But on one occasion, either I was late calling to him, or he was slow in responding, and the papers landed in the Brunswick River. Much to the disgust of the local SP bookies, who relied on the West for the form guide for that day's racing. My report to Captain Snook first thing Monday morning is not a happy memory. I'd rather get rid of that. Shortly after that little incident, one of the agents at the dropping site parked his new sedan car on the edge of the dropping zone. Rather a foolish thing to do, knowing our bomb aiming facilities from an Anson. And we suffered another indiscretion by dropping the bundle on the roof, which we subsequently learned needed maximum panel beating. Fortunately, this one didn't get back to Charles Snook, so I didn't have another reprimand. Well, speaking of accidents, shortly after that, our one and only Dragonfly, which was a very nice little aircraft, 5 seats, but it had a very bad habit, and that was if you opened up the engines both together, if you just pushed both throttles open together, under certain elements of weather, wind and the like, it would ground loop on the ground before you had it off the ground. Most of us, well, all of us in airline staff, I suppose, were aware of this. But on one occasion, a very senior pilot who had had a lot of time on de Havilland mosquitoes, opened the throttles, and before it took off, it ground looped, went over onto its back, and was a complete write-off. Fortunately, he was able to get out of it without being unduly damaged. But that was the end of our Dragonfly, which was a great shame. We were at the stage, of course, then abandoning Maylands Aerodrome and moving over to Guildford, which was coming into its own. But we were able to also, at that time, buy Anson aircraft. Anson aircraft were in plentiful supply and were cheap, and we were able to purchase some Ansons, which were fitted with all sorts of utility accessories. One of them was for super spreading, and that's a shot of an Anson super spreading. There were good facilities at Guildford. Also, we had quite a good staff there, and we started. Of course, we then had to start training hostesses, which was a wonderful innovation if you were keeping on flying. So we had a new staff of hostesses to train. We had good facilities there, good social facilities as well. We had quite apart from a staff of 70. These are some of the facilities. That's the kitchen, the actual catering, and there's Margella Shaw was the senior flight hostess. She's doing some Morse code there by the look of it. Quite apart from the social facilities, we had our own band, and these were the facilities, or the social facilities were the highlight of Airlines at that stage, with our 70 staff, and were always well attended. The Dove was due to arrive at this stage. Its arrival was not particularly wonderful because it was coming into Maylands at that point. We hadn't quite fully moved over to Guildford, and the servicing facilities were still in the main at Maylands. And I understood the story was that the senior pilot, who shall remain unnamed at the moment, had to see Charles Snook elsewhere, and he was running late, and he, in his worry about this, he forgot to put the undercarriage down. And fortunately it was on grass, and scratched the belly of the Dove, of course, and bent a couple of air screws, propellers, and but apart from that, it was soon in business, and I think the pilot rapidly recovered from the drubbing he got from Captain Snook. I have no doubt about that. Now, by now we had moved to Guildford, and as I say, we had a good staff, we had a band, and lots of social activities, and Guildford looked after us extremely well, and we spent a good time in the early stages, and when the Dove was available to fly on normal routes. Just a word about Captain Snook. He had as a pet this monospar aircraft which he really loved to fly. Charles Snook played a very active part in the ATC training cadets, and he loved to take the monospar and visit his cadets either at Geraldton or Albany or wherever by flying the monospar, and that kept him very interested for a long time. His wife was Dr. Hilda Kershaw, and who looked after him pretty well, but it was obvious that he was beyond flying at this stage. He had deteriorated considerably, and I think spent a lot of time in his wife's facility. But one morning he called me over to his office and said, "Look, we're going out to Maylands Aerodrome. The monospar was still at Maylands. I want to fly it." So I wasn't too happy with this, but there was nothing much you could do. If Charles Snook said, "I'm going to do something," well, okay, you just went along with it. He was going to do it, and no way in the world were you going to stop him. And although I wasn't happy with it, I had to take over the co-pilot's seat. I remember the takeoff was a bit rattly. Didn't altogether keep it straight, but we managed to get off and get over the bank and over the Swan River. And then we came back, and we had the landing ahead of us. And as we approached Maylands, we were very high, and I said to him, "Captain, you're too high. Step it down, please, down lower." So he'd push the control forward, and we'd get onto a lower base. But as we got over the ground, I could see that we were much too high, and I kept calling to him, "Lower, Captain, lower, down lower, get down, get down, get down." And eventually, after many forward passes, backs, crunch, we hit the ground, and fortunately the monospar had a pretty robust undercarriage and didn't collapse. So we ended right way up. And I don't think Charles Snook flew an aircraft again after that. He just wasn't physically capable or mentally capable of doing it. And but I must say I had tremendous regard for Charles Snook, because he inaugurated a local airline which was needed to look after the needs of people out in the country areas. And you've seen the areas that he went over, and he supplied that niche very well and was able to keep it going, and did a tremendous job in having a company which could handle it at the time. Eventually, of course, Airlines WA Limited merged with the major WA airline, which had the Darwin contract, and then after that it was sold to Ansett Transport Industries, which went broke. But a need had been met, and I know that the country people were very, very grateful to the fact that Charles Snook had inaugurated this airline and had made it possible for them to have a reasonable service. I joined the Royal Aero Club in 1950 with a membership number of 35. I must now be in my 63rd year with the Aero Club. By this time, we had received our first all-metal aircraft, which we had talked about, the Dove, and it was a pleasure to fly. I remember doing a station service. We had a station service which used to look after the major cattle stations of the north, and I did that with the then chief pilot, Nelson Hill, who unfortunately left us recently. And I must say I did fall in love with the aircraft, and I was sorry that I was nearing the end of my full-time job with Airlines as a pilot and wouldn't have the opportunity of flying it in the future. But in association with the Aero Club and with private owners of aircraft, I obtained endorsements of some 20 types, going from little chipmunks to Cessna 402s and Aerostars. Meanwhile, our firm had developed rapidly with many country accounting, tax and audit clients. And as I was the only pilot in the firm, I had the very pleasant job of transporting staff around the traps. And in particular, Mount Magnet, for instance, Hill 50 gold mines, Exmouth, Hardiman Moni Hutchinson joint venture, Kalgoorlie, Brennan's Boulder, and many, many others. The Aero Club was a great help in providing aircraft for many years before I could afford to buy my own. And I was very grateful to them in helping me earn a living. From the mid-1960s, I found myself accepting invitations to join the boards of public listed companies. Remember, I was still a pretty young chartered accountant at this stage. I accepted these public listed companies and government quangos, which I found was a very happy change from flying tedium of corporate and tax work, which was my main job. Apart from private flying, I kept doing charter flights, mainly with the clients of Saw-Wheatley and Co. And one of them was Hill 50 gold mines, and I did the charters in singles there, in Cessnas in the main, and Atkins Carlisle, which is now Alasco. I did that in twin-engine aircraft, generally 402s or 310, to all their northern agencies between Perth and Darwin. And I must admit, they turned out to be great fun for me. I remember the end of one long day, as night fell, one character in a rear seat started singing 9 green bottles hanging on the wall. And if one should accidentally fall, there were 8 green bottles hanging on the wall, and so on. And this had been, and he played this, he sang to it, and he played his own accompaniment by holding the palm of his hand over an outlet in the air vent, and then releasing it in time with the music. Went on for some time. Not through the whole 9 green bottles, but at least I didn't know what he was doing because I couldn't see him. And I woke up much later, of course. However, we turned the cabin lights down and all was quiet. And I remember how quiet it was as we approached Broome Airport. This was at night. And then all of a sudden, on final, an alarm bell went off. Clang, 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 clang. And I realised that I'd packed in my luggage an alarm clock with a very loud alarm, and thought I'd set it on 7:30 a.m, but I'd set it on 7:30 p.m. And away it went. And it was stored just behind the rear seats. So at least that squared the score with the vocalist. In 1973 I decided to upgrade, and I acquired a Class 4 instrument rating, and 77 upgraded to a Class 1 command instrument rating. And the latter got me down into Perth Airport and others safely on many poor weather occasions. I can certainly recommend holding a Command 1 instrument rating. It takes you out of a lot of trouble. The first real instrument approach I had to do was at Port Moresby in our Cessna 315, now Cessna 310, whilst on a private family trip to Vale. This was after the war, of course, when Vale had settled down. And I've already talked about them on previous talks. From 1982 onwards, I started buying my own aircraft and operated from Perth Airport for a while, and then decided to move to Jandakot and later bought a hangar to house them. I started with a 1982 Piper Turbo Lance, 85 a Mooney M20, 86 a Mooney 252, and 93 a Cessna 310. The Cessna 310 JC1 I sold to the Aero Club in 1998. My favourite aircraft in that pack was the Mooney 252. Now 252 happens to be the maximum airspeed in knots of the aircraft, and the aircraft was intercooled and turbocharged. It had a rated altitude of 28,000 feet in long-range tanks for 9 hours endurance. As a member of the AMP Principal Board for 6 years, I had to attend a board meeting in Sydney every month. I elected to travel commercial one month and Turbo Mooney the next, mostly at 25,000 feet and, of course, wearing an oxygen mask. Sometimes I had a co-pilot or I took one of the family, sometimes I was solo. I established an international speed record Perth-Sydney for light aircraft at 370 kilometres per hour, and then a year later with Shirley Adkins, incidentally, as a co-pilot, I set a new one at 380 kilometres per hour, 8.6 hours. And I remember it was a long day for Shirley, and I don't think the high altitude really suited her. She was glad when it was all over. 2 months later, in the same aircraft, with Malcolm Ashworth of Bunbury, we procured another record for around Australia at 281 kilometres per hour, 36.7 hours, including 3.8 hours on the ground, refuelling and topping up oxygen. That was a very long 1.5 days. At the same time, Paris gave us 13 intercity speed records, which to the best of my knowledge have not been broken. Some may have been, but no one's told me. And who cares? It's history. But it was a very interesting time for me. I now come to my inroads into helicopters, light helicopters. The early 80s was one of our 3 sons, Courtney, whom I've had out to this sort of occasion, who was a merino consultant in the sheep business, was complaining about the terrific mileage he had to drive to look after clients, attend ram sales, and asked me if there would be an easy way of getting around the country. Courtney was farming at Denmark, and most of his clients were in the southwest. Although I didn't confess it at the time, I was wanting to learn to fly helicopters. And of course, unfortunately for me, this gave me an opportunity to get started and also provided me with a valid reason to convince my wife Sylvia that that was a good idea. Because I don't think she thought it was originally a good idea. I enrolled with Jandakot helicopters in May '84, got a private licence by July and decided it was time to go to Sydney, buy a second-hand Robinson R22, a 2-seater, and ferry it back to Perth. I had 44 hours in my logbook, and my instructor, Ron Shortis, told me I was crazy to even attempt it on my own and could end up killing myself. I naturally didn't believe him, and I didn't bend it on the way home, solo. No one would have been silly enough to have come with me anyhow. I very nearly lost it when, near the south coast of South Australia, at about 1,000 feet over the sandhills, and not too far from a violent thunderstorm to the north, it suddenly plunged downwards in a microburst, and all I could do, except praying of course, was to apply full power, hold it steady until I was over undulating sandhills and in ground effect. The ground effect suddenly stopped the rapid descent. Perhaps my instructor Ron did have a point after all. He knew what he was talking about. We let Courtney, our son, have the aircraft for 3 years after he had got his rotary licence, and until he had sold the farm and moved the family to Perth. We then shared the R22 at Jandakot. Each of the other 3 R22s we eventually owned were cross-hired to Jandakot helicopters. And you might recall the man running Jandakot helicopters was one Derek Doak, who was a very experienced and a very competent instructor and a nice guy. By 1984, I had a commercial licence on rotaries and had done a night rating course with Phil Smith of the Department of Civil Aviation. So I registered a business name, Wheatley Helicopters, got an operator's licence from DCA and started doing charters. One interesting period was from November 1986, the America's Cup period. But I was kept busy taking young and very attractive visiting female photographers from a helipad at Roos Head, Fremantle, over the races while they were in progress. We were at 500 feet right-hand circuit, and the fixed wings were at 1,000 feet left-hand circuit. A wonderful way to view a boat race. Another satisfying charter in an R22 was to Hill 50, Mount Magnet, but not in my capacity as chairman of the board, for the general manager to do a reconnaissance of the company's mining leases. We flew around the main leases the company owned, and when we were over one of them, the manager said, "That area looks suspicious. We are not working it, but someone is." So being in a helicopter, we landed. I picked up a metal company disc, an ID disc that was on the ground, with the employee's number on it. So the GM knew who to question, including when we got back to the mine. The guy had treated a lot of ore without handling the tailings too well. And we never found out how much illicit gold he had gotten away with, but by then it was too late anyhow. General manager was pleased he had approved the charter, and I'm sure the board's rating rose a little higher, at least in the view of the general manager. Unfortunately, in 1990, a highly qualified fixed wing pilot with only 100 hours on rotaries on a photographic run off Rottnest Island lost control, and JVC ended up on the ocean bed. Both on board managed to get out, and before it sank, thank goodness. I then bought a new R22 Beta in Sydney and ferried it back with Courtney. Paris gave us another certificate for this run, 84.2 kilometres per hour, 23.8 hours in the air, which is nothing to write home about, as the time taken includes an overnight stop and a night's sleep. Some record. In 1994, I bought a Robinson R44 four-seater, and we ferried it from Sydney to Perth and cross-hired it to Jandakot helicopters. This proved to be a wonderful aircraft, and I have to admit, when I had to stop flying, I sadly missed flying the R44. It was a first-class aircraft. By 1999, I was then in my 80s, My family convinced me that I had had a good innings and that it was time to retire. So I rather reluctantly agreed to let my licence lapse after 57 years of fixed wings, 57 years of fixed wings and 15 years of rotaries, with a total of just under 5,000 hours. Time for a change of direction. My life has been a succession of invitations from widely divergent sources, most of which I have been grateful to accept and to enjoy. Thank you for being such a patient and attentive audience.